How does this one work? Mhm. Okay. Morning, everyone, and welcome to the Public Sector and Not-for-Profit Accounting Special Interest Group. Before we really start, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. So our meeting is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who might be here today. So the way we've had this session program, so in the first half, we'll start with some technical updates to see what our regulator partners really want from us in terms of research, what type of research project we've got out there where, us as academics, we could really contribute to that and have a sort of impact, so work together. We'll have some morning tea after this first half, and then the second half, we'll have some paper presentation. So given taking time into consideration, so we'll start with Anthony first. Anthony will talk about, provide an update about, the type of project and accounting standards we've got in New Zealand. So up to you, so to Anthony.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's interesting coming in a little bit earlier and seeing people walk around and mingle to feel the energy in the room, which is fantastic. So I wish I was there, but probably quite good I'm not, because I'm not feeling very well this morning. I've already got an echo. Okay, I'll carry on with the delay. Here, focus for the next 20 minutes, which is pretty quick for me, is to cover public benefit entities. And in New Zealand, as I hope most of you know, public benefit entities, PBEs, cover our public sector and not-for-profit entities. We follow IPSAS as a starting base, but we definitely have scope for amending and changing those international standards, but we at least use IPSAS as a starting base for those two sectors. So the standards for not-for-profits and public sector in New Zealand are very consistent, in contrast to for-profit entities that follow IFRS. So we've still got in New Zealand and have a multi-sector, multi-standard approach, quite different from Australia. Today, just noting time, we're going to see how far we get, but I did want to have a focus on the significant IPSAS-B projects because I feel like that is the area where there is capacity for research because those projects take a while, and that research will definitely be able to influence the development of those international standards. I doubt very much we're going to get through all this material. In fact, I know we won't. Many of the slides that I've got afterwards on New Zealand developments can be taken as read and are quite self-explanatory when you work through them in your own time. So these slides will be made available immediately after this session, but we'll see how far we get in 25 minutes or so. We'll see how significant IPSAS-B projects I did want to focus on here. And maybe before I step into here, when I think about research, and I was thinking about this morning, what is the most useful research for standard setters? And for me, when I think about the public sector and not-for-profits, it's really around user needs. When users are picking up financial statements, what information do they want? What is the most relevant and important information for them? How do they want to receive that information? We've really got to challenge how we prepare financial statements at the moment. That just can't be the future. That's my personal views on a Sunday morning. Be really interesting study of how many people are actually picking up financial statements and using them. Don't get me wrong, they're an absolutely critical governance and accountability tool, but how many of the broader public are reading the financial statements of the New Zealand government? How many people are reading the financial statements of their local council? Really interesting studies and research that could be done there. And if they're not, why not? And what information do they want? And how do they want to receive it? So maybe that's my plug at the start. There'll be fascinating research into user needs. But of course, financial statements remain important from accountability and governance perspective. So we all know that financial statements, there's different users, but that wider user perspective research on that would be really interesting. So that said, let's move into significant IPSAS-B projects, International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. And there's a huge amount happening here. And there's a huge amount happening in New Zealand and Australia across the not-for-profit sector in general and the public sector. A lot of mood for change and improvements. At the IPSAS-B level, a lot of change coming through because it feels like I've been saying this for the last 3 or 4 years. They're catching up to the ISB, where they got new standards on revenue, they got new standards on measurement, they got new standards on leases, they got new standards on natural resources. They're getting into sustainability. So there's a huge amount happening at the IPSAS-B. That is, the staff there is less than a quarter of the ISB. So it's amazing what the IPSAS-B is getting through. But they're trying to do it with limited resources. So I'm just going to touch on some of these to give you some insights. And the first one will be of interest and is the flavor of, I was about to say flavor of the month, flavor of the year, flavor for the next 3 years, sustainability and climate reporting. And the IPSAS-B is coming into that space and saying, for the public sector, what should we do around sustainability? And what does sustainability mean for the public sector? So the IPSAS-B issued a consultation paper. Remembering a consultation paper is getting those initial thoughts and ideas before they decided project direction on the 9th of May, closing in September. So in summary, the IPSAS-B is asking, are they best placed to develop sustainability guidance or standards for the public sector around the world? And it's very much that first question. Should they be getting into the space? Should they be doing it before they actually start? So the IPSAS-B are very much, well, almost at ground zero. Of course, we know the significant developments by the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board. We know that other jurisdictions, including New Zealand, have developed their own sustainability standards for-profit entities. So the IPSAS-B is asking, okay, what about the public sector? Public sector has a significant impact on the climate and our environment around the world, and public policy has a significant impact on climate change. So to what extent should the IPSAS-B issue guidance? Very much an open question at the moment. Interesting when you look at the IPSAS-B, what do they mean by sustainability? And when you read their consultation paper, they're very much locked into talking about the sustainability development goals from the UN. And just from that, you can see the wide spectrum of how the scope of sustainability from a public sector perspective, covering all these areas. But like many international standard setters and national standard setters, they are highlighting climate as a starting point. But of course, it gets into a significant number of wider areas. This slide's interesting, and I've taken it directly from the AFAANZ. And I think the green box is really interesting in that you think of the scope of what sustainability could mean for the public sector. So when we think about scope, it's the impact of climate change on an entity. That's generally where the for-profit's going. And then it's the impact an entity is having on the environment. And when I talk to AFAANZ staff, they say, yep, that's definitely going to be the current thinking, is that that's included, the impact that the public sector is having on the environment, and then stretching even further the impact of government policy on the environment and climate change. Government policy around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, how they're actually going to measure that and report that. So it's getting much potentially, and I highlight potentially because this is all new and they haven't made final decisions, potentially much wider than when the for-profit entities are going around sustainability and climate reporting. So big challenges for the AFAANZ. So the AFAANZ have highlighted enablers. They have got no funding. They haven't got a separate board. They haven't got a framework. They haven't got anything. That's but they're starting. So they've got this CP talks about a number of enablers that will need to be put in place to enable them to start developing sustainability development standards. Obviously, funding is a huge one. I mean, who's going to fund it? A government's going to commit to international sustainability standards and provide money. Cool. So that's sustainability. Then natural resources, very closely related topic. The AFAANZ have issued a consultation paper open till October. And so what is natural resources about? As a title, quite wide scope. But when you get into it, gets narrower. And so it's considering to what extent should the value of a country's natural resources be recognised on its balance sheet, recognising that certain countries or many countries have significant resources, unextracted mineral reserves and other types of resources that aren't on their balance sheet. So, and that drive significant value for that government in that country. So should that be sitting on the balance sheet? What is a resource? And this is where it starts to get a little bit narrower. A natural resource is it is a resource defined by the conceptual framework. So it's got to be capable of generating benefits or service potential. Naturally occurring. So you can get in quite long debates around what do we mean by naturally occurring. Came into existence without actions of humankind. And there isn't much around the world globally that hasn't been impacted by the impact of humankind. So it's interesting to explore that. And then in its natural state, so it's not subject to human intervention. So you can see it's getting narrower and narrower in terms of what we're talking about here. So the CP talks about 3 specific types of natural resources and explores that by applying it to the conceptual framework and asking, can you meet the definition of an asset? So water, subsoil resources, and living resources. And you just think about the definition of an asset, you've got to control it. So how can you show control of a water in its natural state? Very difficult. If you get over that hurdle, can you measure it? Even harder, how do you measure water and other types of natural resources? So the preliminary view from the CP is that in many cases you won't be able to meet the definition of an asset, and it won't be appropriate to bring onto the balance sheet. But then maybe the more interesting discussion is, okay, if it's not in the balance sheet, should information be disclosed somewhere, either in the financial statements or somewhere else in the annual report, or should it be subject to some type of completely separate external reporting? And I'm sure Australia is no different than the New Zealand, that we have many metrics for water and other natural resources that have been managed extremely carefully, that sit outside financial reporting or external reporting, and they're getting managed quite well. So do we need to climb into the space, being the FAANZ question mark. Revenue and transfer expenses. I'll just touch on that really briefly because that's been going for a long time. Expecting a re-exposure in December because they issued EDs a couple of years ago. FAANZ have ended up in a different space. They will need to likely re-expose. But the highlight is that if you have a binding arrangement, so that means you've got enforceable and specific obligations to use money in a specific way. So I give you $1 million and I set out an agreement that sets how you're going to spend that money, then you'd recognize that money I've given you as you satisfy those obligations. It's amazing when I say that out loud. How has that taken 6 years to get to that point? But it's revenue gets very complicated. But if those obligations aren't specific, aren't enforceable, then if I give you $1 million, doesn't matter if you're going to spend it over 3 years, you recognize that day one revenue immediately. So I guess the debate comes around enforceability as one, and what do we mean by specific? And I know the AASB spent a number of years on that and have issued standards in that space. Concessionary leases, the highlights is that the FAANZ have got a separate project on concessionary leases. So that includes leases for nil or nominal amounts or any amount that's been discounted compared to market value. And we've just come back from the FAANZ's June meeting, and there were strong views across the board table that concessionary leases should be brought onto the balance sheet and should be measured at fair value or some kind of market value, which is probably a little bit of a surprise to us because when they issued an ED last year in December, there was significant pushback from New Zealand. And I know Australia have tried to bring in concessionary leases, but got pushback also and have withdrawn it. So Australia and New Zealand are quite consistent in highlighting the cost benefit considerations with concessionary leases and saying it's just too difficult. Internationally, there's quite strong views, and they're doing it in the UK, that it can be done and should be done. So really interesting. There seems to be this view internationally that if you have a government has a concessionary lease, it's giving a concession, that it's giving something away. So that should be accounted for, giving something away, especially if you're giving something away to the private sector, which happens a lot in Europe. They were quite concerned about that, concessions by public sector entities to private entities. That doesn't happen so much in New Zealand. Not sure about Australia, but Europe were very concerned about that. Governments giving stuff away, effectively giving favours to for-profit entities. Measurement, if you get the right people in the room, they could talk about measurement all day. Some people could talk about it for a week. Measurement from an FAANZ perspective is, as a starting point, asking the question, should we introduce IFRS 13 fair value into the public sector? And the conclusion is that if you hold assets for a financial capacity, yes, IFRS 13 works fine. But if you hold assets for an operational capacity, and remembering that the majority of assets in the public sector are held for operational capacity to deliver education, health services, and other services to the public, then no, fair value doesn't work. The concept of highest and best use doesn't work for the public sector because you're not holding that asset to sell it or to generate cash flows, or not predominantly. You're holding it for that service potential. So the FAANZ have decided they want a different measurement base from fair value for assets held for their operational value. They've agreed to that, but then after that, there's divergence in views. And the divergence in views cover a number of areas when you think about, or should, and they call it a current operational value. So should current operational value be only entry value, or should it allow exit value? What do you do around surplus capacity? If you've got a school building that can hold 1,000 students, but you're only using it for 500, what do you do about restrictions? And I know that's been a big debate in Australia around restrictions over use or sale. To what extent should an asset's value be discounted if it can only be used for a certain thing? Modern equivalent assets. There's just an endless, this is where people can talk all day. So that the FAANZ is debating those characteristics of a current operational value at the moment. Plenty of scope for research there. Cool. So I've raced through that. And these slides will be made available, so you can see, have a quick look at some of these extra slides I've got. So 20 past, just noting a major development in New Zealand is that we are looking to introduce a new standard for the public sector based on IFRS 16. And the AFAANZ have issued a new standard in January this year that was aligned with IFRS 16, both for lessee and lessor. So we're busy in New Zealand now looking at that international standard, considering what amendments we need to make to bring it into New Zealand. But we'll issue an ED probably around September this year based on the IPSAS 43, which is aligned with IFRS 16. The key thing to remember around leases for the public sector is that the AFAANZ, and I think I've highlighted already, have split this project into two. So phase one is completely aligned with IFRS 16 for your standard lease contracts. So they've issued a standard for phase one, and phase two, they're working on it at the moment to develop a new ED for concessionary leases, so that we'll issue a new standard in New Zealand excluding concessionary leases, recognising that the international board is still working. A bit of a time frame there. When you see the dates 2027, we're going to have a long lead in for a new leasing standard for the public sector and for our not-for-profits, recognising the amount of work it required to introduce IFRS 16 into the for-profit sector. Cool. Service performance reporting. With time against me, just highlighting, we've got a new standard on service performance. I know the AASB are thinking about and working on a new standard in the space. In New Zealand, we've got a standard. It's been in place for 3 or 4 years, maybe 5, and is now effective. And entities are applying it for the first time now. So really interesting opportunities for research around this new standard to see the impact of it and the type of information that comes out. Because one of the main things around this new standard on service performance information, reporting on why you exist, what you hope to achieve, and what activities you've done, is that it's extremely high level and principles based. It allows significant flexibility for what you disclose. All you need to do is a principle of selecting the most meaningful and relevant information. So really interesting what's going to come out over the next couple of years when entities apply this new standard for the first time. I know some preparers, they like rules-based. They like, tell me, Anthony, what to do. And I'm saying, no, you need to apply judgment. And the auditors, they feel a bit nervous around this because there's so much scope for selecting what you do. And we've removed the words of outcomes, outputs, impacts. You're not required to disclose any of those things. Just disclose what the entity has done. And if you want to report your impacts, which the Governor General in New Zealand is pushing hard for the public sector, is saying, yeah, recognise 48, but I want public sector entities to report impacts. Of course, you can do that within the standard, but it allows flexibility. Cool. I'll just touch on final point, and then other points haven't covered in the slides and be sent around later. Final point for 2 minutes is just announcing incorporated societies. And this is where I do see scope for research, and that we've got new legislation requiring incorporated societies to prepare financial statements in accordance with XRB standards for the first time. The previous act for incorporated societies in New Zealand was 1908. That's a long time ago. There was no gap requirements in that legislation. So your cricket clubs, your workingmen's clubs will have requirements to follow our standards for the first time. The area that I'll be really interested in from a research perspective is of what is the difference, or is there a difference between incorporated societies, the nature of them, and the reporting needs of them for incorporated societies compared to registered charities. Because if there is significant difference in the types of transactions or the information needs, then we need to consider, do we make changes to our not-for-profit standards to account for this new group of entities applying our standards for the first time. So we've got not-for-profit standards. They're used by 28,000 charities in New Zealand. Do we need to change them for incorporated societies or provide additional guidance? Research would be very useful in that space. So what makes incorporated societies different, or maybe they're not different? Research can help that. Come to 25 past, so just what are we talking about here from incorporated societies? We've got about 6,500 entities that, in theory, would be required to apply our standards for the first time. Why I say in theory is that I like to think that many of them have chosen as best practice to use our standards, but they've only got a legislative requirement now, but they've got till 2026 to get sorted and apply our standards. And there is exemptions for smalls, less than $10,000. So a lot will continue to have no reporting requirements. In fact, that's not completely true. They'll have reporting requirements in legislation, which is very minimal, about 4 or 5 lines of reporting requirements. Cool. Okay, so I've come to time. So I'll hand back, and I'm not sure how I don't think we've even got time for questions.
Thank you, Anthony. We'll have time for questions after all the presentations. That was a very insightful presentation. I'm sure it's going to help people in the room and also those attending online. Our next presenters are from the AASB. So we've got Al, Patricia, and Maggie who'll be presenting today on the AASB's research project and their information needs. Thank you.
So, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Ushi, for inviting the AASB to attend today's event and giving an update. So today, we're joined by our chair, Keith Kendall, and also Patricia, as well as Al, who's going to give updates on various projects. So, my name is Maggie, for those who don't know me, and I am a project manager at the AASB, and I predominantly look at the not-for-profit private sector entities, mainly the not-for-profit financial reporting framework project. So I'm just going to click. Yes. So I'll give a high-level overview of what that project is about and obviously what key research needs of that project. So the board has decided to develop a possible third differential reporting tier, being Tier 3 general purpose financial statements. And the primary objective of that project is to develop simplified financial reporting requirements that meets the financial statement user needs of smaller not-for-profit entities. And the board has decided to develop these proposals to be included in a discussion paper that we're planning to hopefully issue by the end of September, early October. But in terms of developing these possible future Tier 3 reporting requirements, the board has in mind transactions and balances of not-for-profit entities with revenue between 500,000 to 3 million. But that's not really intended to limit the entities that may be able to use or prepare Tier 3 general purpose financial statements in the future, because the board's decided not to specify reporting thresholds within Australian accounting standards. Now, at the same time, the boards will be consulting on the removal of the ability for entities to prepare special purpose financial statements in the future as part of its revised conceptual framework, as you can see in the second line on the slides. And that's going to be relevant for both. Oh, sorry. There we go. And that's going to be relevant for both not-for-profit private sector and the public sector as well. So we're currently looking at a consultation period of 6 months once we publish the discussion paper. And we're looking hopefully to be doing some in-person consultations in various states and territories, as well as online consultation. And we're looking at developing a survey instrument to hopefully be able to solicit and engage with stakeholders widely and broadly, given the size of the entities that we're interested in and the stakeholders that we are wanting feedback from. Now, the board will be reviewing the feedback once, hopefully by April next year, before we decide whether or not its preliminary reviews will be proceeded into an exposure draft stage. So we're taking a really conservative approach in terms of how we develop these proposals. Very aware that, as Anthony has pointed out as well that research into user needs is going to be paramount as well in developing these proposals. Whether or not the proposals that the board's decided are going to work for the size of the entities within that, the not-for-profit private sector as well. So we do have on our research plan to do some research, and I will be touching on that as well in a later stage. But we are looking at doing some research on what are common transactions of a T3 size not-for-profit private sector entity. So we'll be really interested to know if you are doing any of that kind of research or are planning to do any of that research in the future. That will be really helpful for, for us in terms of the project. And also perhaps if you are really interested in that sort of research that we are looking at doing, please get in touch with us. So, and finally, I'll touch on the post-implementation review. So the AASB has commenced a post-implementation review on certain not-for-profit specific topics, including income of not-for-profit entities, control, consolidation, and definition of structured entities and related party disclosures. And that's relevant for both not-for-profit private sector and the public sector entities. Now, as part of that post-implementation review, we are performing a preliminary literature review. So if any attendees have been involved in or are aware of any research into those topics or have any feedback for us, it would be great if you can get in touch with us as well. So that was all I was going to cover. So now I'll hand over to Patricia, who will give you an update on the public sector entities. Thanks.
The big one. Hi, everyone. So my role at the AASB is really to manage public sector specific projects. And the first project on the screen here is insurance activities in the public sector. This is a joint project that we're doing with the New Zealand Accounting Standards Board, so with Anthony's team. So the project really is to look at how the new insurance standard, AFAANZ 17, should be applied to public sector entities. And the two boards have issued an exposure draft. Both of those have closed on the 8th of June. And the board will be looking at the comments and reiterating some of the issues at the respective August meeting. As Anthony mentioned, measurements in public sector has always been a key issue. The ASB is doing something different to what the IPSASB is doing. So we are continuing with the fair value model. So the project fair value measurement of non-financial assets of not-for-profit public sector entities, that project, the aim is to provide guidance to help public sector entities apply the principles of the AASB 13 more consistently. So we've recently issued an ED. The comments closed, but we are still receiving comments. So if you are interested in giving us comments on that ED, we'll love to hear it. But yes, so research on measuring public sector assets, if you have any information on those, we'll love to hear it. The AASB 1059 service concession arrangement for grant halls, it's a relatively new standard. It was really effective for period on or after 1st January 2020. So really 30 June 2022, it's really the second year that the standard has been applied. But we've heard from stakeholders that there are issues with this standard in terms of the judgment required to identify what transaction should be in scope of the standard. So the board decided to do the post-implementation review of the standard earlier. So the aim is to issue an invitation to comment document by September for comment. And I think at this stage, we haven't seen a lot of research on service concession arrangement from the grant hall perspective. So if you happen to be looking at this area, please let us know. The board is also doing the post-implementation review of quite a number of public sector specific accounting standards. So that includes land on the roads, contributions, contribution by owners, disaggregated disclosures and missing items. How can I miss that? I think recently I haven't seen a lot of research on those areas. But if you know of anyone or if you are interested in doing research on those topics, please let us know. These two projects that are on our current, so these are the two key IPSASI projects that Anthony mentioned. So the ASB will be monitoring those two projects. We haven't decided whether we will adopt the principles of those two, but we'll be looking at those two projects very closely. So revenue and transfer expenses, as Maggie mentioned, we are doing a PR of our own income for not-for-profit standard. So any discussion that the IPSASB has on this area will be applicable to us. And hence, in the second column, we've put NFP in brackets. So even the IPSASB looks at public sector specific issues, any principles we think might be relevant to the private not-for-profit entities, will also consider it. And I probably won't go too much into the leases project since Anthony has already mentioned. On the next slide here, I've noted research projects on discounting long-term liabilities in public sector and service performance. So even though I'm saying it's research project, they are actually on our setting work program. The only reason why I'm saying it's research because we will start with a bit of research. So when we say research, we're looking at what our entity is currently doing and what are the current issues with the standard. So yes, if you are looking into this area, we would like to know more. Sustainability reporting, we can't really talk about setting without mentioning sustainability reporting. So as you know, the ASB has a project to look at for-profit some of things on this. But the board is monitoring the IPSASB's work and the international bodies' work on this area for the public sector and private sector. But this will perhaps be later on in the project when we look into details of what public sector or private sector issues might need to be addressed by the board. Public sector financial reporting framework. This is really a project that the FRC is leading. So FRC has a public sector working group that's leading this project. So the aim of this project really is to look into, are there any ways to simplify financial reporting in the public sector? So the ASB, I think in 2017, did some research and found that majority of public sector entities are applying Tier 1 general purpose financial statements. Recently, there are more people adopting the Tier 2. That was the reduced disclosure regime. We're not sure whether the new Tier 2 is being applied yet. But there was discussion that there might be room to simplify that a bit more, particularly for the smaller types or less risky types of public sector entities. So that is an area that the FRC is leading. So we don't really have too much to update you on, but maybe next time. Any questions on the projects at this stage before I hand over to Al to talk about research? No?
Thanks, Patricia, and hello, everyone. And next slide. Yep. So I'm Al, and I'm a project manager at the SSB as well. And I work with Eric, who is not here with us today. And he's actually in the conference, so you might get a chance to talk to him. And we work in the research center. I myself also work on other projects in for-profit and not-for-profit sector. So for research, why it is important to SSB, because we do have the evidence-informed standard setting framework. So any academic research would actually inform the decision-making of the SSB board to, in terms of setting the standards. And we really appreciate any contribution from the academic community in that sense. And we do some research in-house, and this is just an example of the 3 projects we are currently working on. The first one is a joint research project with the Malaysia Accounting Standard Boards to understanding the usefulness of the practical experience provided in some of the recent standards. And for this one, we are particularly looking at WSB 16 as an example. And the second one, which was actually a study presented in our research forum last year or 2 years ago, understandability of accounting standards. So it's ongoing at the moment. And the last one, as Maggie mentioned just now, this is of particular relevance to our not-for-profit financial reporting framework project, understanding the common transactions of Tier 3 not-for-profit entities. And this may not be the last time you hear us talking about how much we want to understand the user's need in this specific sector, both in New Zealand and in Australia. So if you do have any paper project related to these 3 topics, more than happy to have a further discussion. And moving on to the WSB Research Forum. So this is one of our flagship events every year. And for this year, we will have it on 5th of December, which is a Monday. And it will be a hybrid event. So we would have a venue in Melbourne, inviting all the presenters and panelists coming down to Melbourne to have a conversation, sharing their experience with the practitioners, regulators, and academics. So for this year, we kind of as a structure for these 3 selected projects, starting from a broader, very broad study exploring the horizon of the financial reporting, and then moving slightly narrowed down to the sustainability-related reporting, climate-related disclosures, and then ending with a very specific case study looking at the disclosure on soil health and the related matters in Australia. So the registration for the research forum will open soon. The best way to keep up with our activities is probably to sign up to the WSB weekly newsletter. And more importantly, we actually have the open for expression of interest for the research forum for next year open at the moment, which is closed on 5th of August. And you are more than welcome to submit any interest to the research at wsb.gov.au. So some of the topics we are particularly interested in, not limited to not-for-profit and public sector, so including intangible assets, forward-looking information, non-financial disclosures, for example, management commentary, so it's performance reporting, and goodwill impairment. And we will have a booth at the area outside during the conference as well. So we will have some posters and more informations. If you want to know more about our research forum this year and next year, more than welcome to stop by and have a conversation with any of the staff there. And yeah, so this is a new initiative we had this year, which is a WSB SSR and working paper series. So we understand that a lot of the academics, they want to make impact of their study and make their study more visible to the regulators, to the standard setters, and to actually make a implication for our standard setting work. So we do have these initiatives. And so if you want to know more about it, welcome to have a conversation with us at the booth or whenever you see one of the staff. And which is not on the slides, we also have another initiative this year, which is a WSB Dialogue series. So we had 2 already, one on sustainability reporting and one on intangible assets. Yeah, and we're having another one coming in August on, oh my God, I can't remember the title. Yeah, thank you, thanks, Kate. We have another one coming up in August, which is digital reporting. And also another one in September. This one I do know is on 12th of September. It's actually for not-for-profit. So we do invite practitioners and academics to form a panel to give a discussion on certain topics within for 1 hour. And you're more than welcome to register for that. And there's chances for interactions with those panelists as well. And yeah. So we have covered a lot from Maggie, Patricia, and myself. The best way, again, to keep up with us is probably to sign up to the WSB weekly newsletter. So we will include all the documents open for comments, all the upcoming events, and for example, the dialogue series and other speaker events in all those newsletters. And we do have some WSB staff papers, research reports on our website, and also YouTube channels. So if you missed any of our previous dialogue series, you can watch it on YouTube as well. So, yep, that's all from me, and thank you.
Thank you, Maggie, Patricia, and Al for your amazing presentation. I'm sure it's going to benefit people in the room and online as well. Our next presenter is Mel from the ACNC. Mel has not been able to make it today, but he's pre-recorded his presentation. So let's all hear what Mel has to say.
Hello, my name is Melanie Yates. I'm one of the directors at the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. I want to welcome you all to the AFAANZ conference, and especially to the Public Sector and Not-for-Profit Special Interest Group Symposium. I note the theme of this year's symposium is Current State and Future Directions of Accounting Research within Australia and New Zealand public and not-for-profit space. So the ACNC is a big supporter of research, and we do that through the provision of data. On data.gov.au, the ACNC provides 12 data sets which are refreshed on a regular basis. These include the ACNC Registered Charities dataset, the Annual Information Statement datasets for each of the years from 2013 through to 2020. There are also Trust and Confidence datasets for 2013, 2015 and 2017. Separately, we have just released a charities report for the 2020 reporting period, including the refreshed data cube, and that can be accessed directly from the ACNC website. If you go to acnc.gov.au and select the Guidance and Tools tab on the right-hand side, then select ACNC Reports, and under A for Australian Charities Report, you will see the 8th edition there, which includes the interactive data cube. The change to that data cube is primarily relating to programs. 2020 was the first year that we collected information from charities about the programs they operate, where they operate, and who they help. A big change from what we used to collect around the activities that charities undertook. Now, I do have a couple of potential research topics which hopefully may help to inform some of the things that we're thinking about, but I do have some caveats that I just want to outline before I share those. And that is that this is really for general information only. None of these potential topics reflect government policy, and they don't really reflect any official ACNC views. We've had some brief internal conversations about some of the things that we think would be helpful if further research was undertaken. But again, they don't necessarily reflect official ACNC views, and they do not reflect government policy. The ACNC are unable to financially support research, but our very valuable contribution to research is the provision of data, which I just talked about. So some of the potential topics include how charities accept or use cryptocurrency and risks in relation to that, issues that social investment presents for charities and also for regulation from our perspective, quantifying the benefits of a single definition of charity in Australia, The impacts of COVID on registered charities, the not-for-profit sector more broadly, and that really centres around sustainability and the impacts that the pandemic has had in that regard. The level of understanding of obligations or charity law by charities, as well as the public, and what the ACNC could do to improve it. So that really centres around our educational role in informing what charities need to comply with and informing what the public need to know around the charitable sector and our role. And we're thinking here about, I guess, some of the issues which have cropped up and the understanding of some of the legal concepts there. DGR for all charities, is that feasible? What would the cost be? What would the benefits be? What would the impact be on the charity sector more globally? And also the current landscape of regulatory burden for registered charities. So we commissioned several pieces of research years ago around red tape and the impacts of red tape and the costs to the sector. It would be interesting to see how that has evolved and what the regulatory burden for registered charities currently is. Now, hopefully that gives you some food for thought. And Ushi has very generously agreed to collate any questions or anything that you would like to pass on to us. So please feel free to contact Ushi, and Ushi will pass any feedback or any questions on to the ACNC, and we're more than happy to answer any questions that might arise as part of this session. So I wish you a great symposium. I hope all of you come up with some great ideas and continue to undertake research to help trust and confidence in Australia for charities. Thank you very much for your time.
Feel free to pass it on to me. We are ahead of time, and if it's okay with David, we might start with his presentation. So David's presentation would be about an overview of the Australian Not-for-Profit Accounting Standard Research Program. Thank you. Also, those who are online, if you have questions, feel free to just type them in the Q&A section, and I will just read them to our audience at the end of this first half of the session.
Thank you very much, Ushi. Really appreciate you stepping in to chair the session today. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there, but it's a fantastic program that you put together and really interesting, up to date, and looking forward to the rest of the papers. So thank you. My job today is to just very briefly give everyone an update on the Australian Non-Profit Accounting Standards Research Program, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it is a coming together of a number of scholars from across the universities you can see at the top of the screen here, and supported very much by community directors. And the idea of the process is for this group to get together to be able to both perform and undertake research relating to not-for-profit accounting standards, research relating to the effective and efficient provision of financial information relating to performance and position of these organisations, and also, I guess, to try and build a group of organisations and people that are actually institutionally building capacity in not-for-profit research. So I want to just very quickly, I only have a few minutes to be able to present on this, to give you a bit of an overview of the project principles initially. And as you can see, I think they're fairly straightforward principles that I'm pretty sure everyone in the room and everyone interested in this SIG and both public and not-for-profit organisations' financial reporting would be supportive of. First and foremost, of course, we're all interested in the community interest as being the primary focus of our work. What can we do to be able to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of services across the not-for-profit sector and ensure that outcomes are being achieved to really build on the sector's capacity to support Australian communities? The other calculus that's really important here, of course, is the cost-benefit calculus, and that's a absolutely critical aspect. And we've just heard Mel talking about the ACNC's concerns about red tape, and I think this is an important element for us to consider as well. We are very keen, as good universities should be, in terms of making sure that our prescriptions and our findings are all very well evidence-based, supporting the development of evidence-based policy, both across accounting standards, but also more broadly in terms of funding and financing human services and other types of service provision that not-for-profits and charities provide in Australia. We're looking at the sector sustainability as a critical for social and economic outcomes. So not only are we concerned about the actual accounting standards themselves, but we're concerned to ensure that there is sustainability at the end of the day, and that these standards and the reports that actually come from those standards support us all in understanding the extent to which that sustainability is maintainable. We're of the view that we need to keep things fairly simple, and I think that's probably a good position to take across a whole lot of policy areas, but this one particularly. And then I think number 6, building capacity within the sector and also those stakeholders of the sector to not only make sure that we've got good accounting standards that make sense from a cost-benefit calculus perspective, but also that people can understand the reports and other information that is prepared and presented as a result of the application of those standards. So to that extent, we have had fantastic support from the Australian Accounting Standards Board, from Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand, CPA Australia, and also Volunteering Australia in terms of supporting specific projects and being able to support the program of research and getting the word out in terms of the findings that we've had, but also being able to, I guess, build on the legitimacy of the outcomes of those findings as well. The objectives then of this group are a fairly high level here, but certainly utility is the highest priority. That is users, funders and regulators, making sure that what comes out from the not-for-profits and charitable sector in terms of financial reporting actually meets the informational and other needs of these very important groups. And indeed, as we all know, that is substantially the substance or the foundation of accounting standards in the first place. We want to make sure that we're focused on proportionate and effective responses to transparency and accountability requirements. One of the things that's really important, I think, and again, harking back to Mel's comments around red tape, is that we do understand the difference between red tape and the important administrative and other functions that charities and not-for-profits should undertake in order to be able to balance that ability to be transparent and to be accountable to their stakeholders, who extend beyond just their members and their service users and so on, but to the whole community because of the tax and other opportunities these organisations have. We want to support the regulatory process and to be able to ensure that that regulatory process is efficient and effective, and that it builds on the capacity of these organisations, and as I say, particularly their capacity to be transparent and to be soundly governed. We want to support increased research into the area across the academy. So we are very happy to recruit new scholars to the effort and new universities to the effort. So this is not intended to be a closed loop or a closed program, but rather a program of trying to increase the communications amongst academics, to increase the mutual support amongst academics, and to prioritise this research within business schools and other faculties within universities. It's a really important aspect because not only does it mean that we get good research, hopefully coming out of universities, but we also have increased opportunities for new researchers coming in to do PhDs and other work in this really important area. So one of the most important aspects of this particular project is really trying to support those scholars and those proto-scholars to be able to increase the amount of research that's undertaken in this area. Current projects that we have are listed here. As you can see, we've got links to some of these projects where we have got some outcomes already achieved, but these projects are in progress variously at various stages. So some are in the field, such as the non-profit asset valuation project being undertaken by Vien Chu and also Prana Agroal at UWA. And also some projects have been going through the process of actually developing what we call industry-ready output, so that we're able to communicate the findings not only through the traditional academic press, if you like, but also through appropriate documentation that allows the industry and regulators, others, to pick up the findings and to be able to apply those findings. So I think I've probably used up my 5 minutes. Here is my contact details, and we're very happy for these slides to be made available to the attendees today and to anyone else that might be interested in the outputs of this group. Thanks very much, Ushi. I really appreciate it.
Now it's time for any questions that we might have in the room or online. I can't see any questions yet online. So if we want to start with people in the room. Yes, Graham.
I don't know if Anthony's still online, is he, or Zoom? So I'm a bit of an outsider. Sorry, Graham. Oh. Is my voice loud enough? Is that better? Yeah, okay. I'm a bit of an outsider to the group, new to the group, shall I say. I work with Ushi at Western Sydney University, but I was just interested in what Anthony said right up the front, right at the very beginning, when he talked about, I suppose, the people who read financial statements, public entity financial statements, about who's actually reading them, who's doing anything with them out there or not. And I thought to myself, well, I was just curious to just tease that out a bit with him, just in respect of, I suppose, the literacy of the audience, going back to literacy skills, back to high schools and what's going on there to teach people about financial literacy, and also about the design of them for maybe different levels of financial reports to different audiences depending on their skills, because obviously these are public entities, whether they're, local government, state government, federal government or whatever, and charities, not-for-profit type of organisations. So that's what I was just interested in when he talked about that, because he just said that, are people reading these financial statements or not? So I didn't know what. Someone over here.
Thank you. Janet Mack from QUT here. I think that the notion of users has gone right throughout all the presentations that we've seen today. And I think it's really important because to some extent, the use that we can make of the research that's being carried on now depends on who's using the information. I should probably also disclose that I did a PhD on users, but a long time, many years than I like to think about now, but about probably coming close to 20 years ago, looking at who uses public sector financial statements. So I did a big survey looking at public sector at the national, sort of state, federal and local government. And the bottom line is nobody uses them. What a surprise, which makes me really wonder about why we're doing what we're doing, because when I say nobody, clearly some regulators look at it, but they don't need general purpose financial reports. They can get the information they want. Unfortunately, in my PhD, I wasn't able to get in some of the really good, interesting stuff that was about what people use them for. Memorably, one gentleman from a local government association said, it's really good size to prop up the front seat of my ute. So that's about the extent of the use. And I think it's sadly, since I did that research, say nearly 20 years ago now, we haven't progressed in looking at who the users are. And and it's very difficult research to find out who the users are, especially now when so much of it is on the web and we can't see. So when I did the research that I did, most of the information wasn't on the web. You actually had to physically get a copy, and I had mailing lists and that sort of stuff. It's really it's difficult research, but I think it's fundamental to what we do in the not-for-profit sector and the public sector, because unless we're producing information that's used, it's a complete and utter waste of time. Thank you.
If I can just echo those comments, thanks very much for that. But from a standard setting perspective, you're dead right that the notion of users, who's using these financial reports, is critical, and it really pervades a lot of the thinking that we're doing. And where the public sector financial reports are concerned, it's been a bit of a black box. So what I really want to get at here is anyone who's interested in doing research in this area on who's actually using public sector financial statements, certainly encourage you to do it and bring it to our attention. So not just in this area, it's any sort of research that you think might be interested or of interest to us as a standard setter, but talking about who the users are for public sector financial statements. Al went through a few different avenues that we had. So primarily the working paper series, strongly recommend you put in that. And one thing just to note on that, with the working paper series, submission to that doesn't preclude publication somewhere else. Okay, so that's an absolutely critical design feature of the working paper series. But even if it's not developed to working paper series level or something like that, we're very interested, and I personally am very interested in getting very up-to-date research on that. Feel free to email us directly and email me directly on this. So Eric, as research principals, head of the research team, is obviously the major point with that, but me personally as well. So bring this research to our attention. It will influence what we do. And we've had this discussion at board meetings when we're considering standard setting where the public sector is concerned, and also NFP, private sector, who is using this, because it does influence what we actually wind up saying needs to go in the standards. So it's not irrelevant research. It's not just of interest to academics. It is something that at least I can guarantee standard setters are looking at quite closely. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm sure Anthony would like to comment on that, and also David, because we have a project on user identification, David and myself. So we'll let Anthony talk.
Yeah, thank you. Really good discussion. So I was coming briefly. Definitely at an international level, we hear a lot of discussion around the general purpose financial information being used by ministers. And the challenge is always about how do we explain it to ministers and make it understandable. So it's happening at that level. From a general public perspective, yeah, really difficult. And of course, the general public are looking to receive information in different ways and in bite sizes and tailored for what they're interested in. So nobody's going to read an annual report of the New Zealand government or Australian or anyone else, pages 1 to 80. But how do we get that one piece of information maybe that they're interested in? I think that's our challenge for the future. But that's some thoughts for a Sunday morning.
Thank you, Ushi, and a great commentary too, Keith. As Ushi said, yes, we do have a project specifically looking at users for not-for-profit organisations reports. But I'll make the comment as well. I think it goes hand in hand with our project on financial literacy. I think one of the key things that worries me sometimes in relation to financial accounting standards is that we have a tendency to focus on the standards without thinking about how we raise the capacity at the same time. And I think we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and simply present simple accounting standards without thinking about the capacity of users and trying to raise the bar in that respect. The second thing I would say is we've done some preliminary work in the WA Parliamentary Research Program over here in the West. And one of the things that we've found, Keith, in relation to public sector financial reporting is that there is not a great readership of financial reports, but there is an incredibly significant support of the preparation of those financial reports. And what members say to us is that they want those things to be done. They want the Auditor General to audit those things. But at the same time, they want to be notified on an exceptions basis rather than having to wade through, in the case of the West Australian Parliament, 130 odd reports, or probably more, in fact, probably up around 150. So that's an interesting concept as well, I think, in terms of understanding that there is appreciation and need for these reports in the minds of the members of Parliament we've spoken to, but not necessarily for reading. Directly, if you like. Thank you.
Great presentations. Thank you for sharing. Will the AASB Research Forum have online streaming? Thank you, Keith.
Yes. So the structure that we're going with this year is it'll be a hybrid event, and that's anticipated how it will be going forward. And by hybrid, there'll be the primary event will be back to where it was up till 2019, where this year it's in Melbourne. So RMIT is the co-host. So the sessions will be held in Melbourne. Anyone is welcome, of course, to come to Melbourne, or those that are Melbourne-based. There'll be the face-to-face event, but then people will be able to, it will be live streamed, and people will be able to dial in, if I can use the old term, will be able to dial in and follow proceedings that way. We anticipate, so no promises on this front, we anticipate that there'll be a Q&A ability with those that are online. I'm assured that is the case. So that's certainly the intention, but yeah, that's the comprehensive answer to say yes, there'll be a live streaming option there.
Thank you, Keith. Patricia, did you want to make a comment too? No. Any more questions? Yes, Graham.
So that's the research. That's the research forum in November. December, yeah. Does the research forum ever go outside Melbourne? Do you go to other states? So next year, where are you thinking of going? Somewhere.
Western Sydney University.
I was waiting. I was waiting for that. I was waiting for that to come in. Yes. North of the border a bit. Bit warmer.
Essentially, we're trying to. We'll have to see how. Okay, so the short answer is yes. We want to move. We want to move it around. Now, one thing that we're experimenting with this year, and I don't want to make too many promises, get ahead of ourselves or anything, but will be the intention is we'll also have what I'm referring to as a satellite event, with the expectation that will be in Brisbane this year. So the satellite event will effectively be an online streaming of the Melbourne event, but to a venue in Brisbane. And if we get that going, if that's as successful as I hope it will be, then the intention would be to roll that out nationwide next year, by which I mean the main capital cities, what we can cover. In terms of the main event, yes, the intention would be to take it somewhere other than Melbourne. it really depends on the circumstances and what winds up being possible. There's a lot of logistics that go on with this, but that's definitely the intention, to take it out of Melbourne next year.
Thank you, Keith. Any more question in the room? Nothing online at the moment. So we have time for one more question. Yes, Janet.
Apologies if I'm hogging the floor here. I just want to comment something David mentioned. I think it's really important, like just because there's not a huge readership and financial statements don't end up on the top of the New York Times best, I was going to say novels, and sometimes they are novels, I suspect, but doesn't mean they're not important. And I've wondered, in Queensland, local government authorities have to produce what's called a community financial report, which is a 4 to 6 page document, which just brings down what's in the financial statements into lay. And I actually suspect, I should remember, but I think it has lay language. So some sort of understanding that people can, without huge financial literacy, can see. So there's lots of pie charts and bar graphs and all that sort of stuff. And I don't know, unfortunately, they mostly seem to be within the annual report themselves, whereas initially the intention was it would be a standalone document, and that it would be available to everyone. And you could sort of, so it's for local governments. I think in the initial phases, which was about 15 years ago, the idea was, I think, that you could push it into people's letterboxes, in local government authorities, so they could have a look. And the thing that appeals to me about that is it's using the financial statements as they are as the base of it, giving people some information that they could understand, and then, giving them the opportunity, if they want to find out a bit more. As far as I know, that hasn't gone, it's certainly nowhere else in Queensland, and I don't think it's gone anywhere else in Australia either. And yet it seems to me to be such a relatively simple and effective way of communicating what's happening in a public sector entity, or any other entity for that matter, what's going on.
Look, I think...
Graham, last question, being mindful of time.
No, I was just going to follow. Oh, sorry, David. Did you want to go first? I was just going to follow.
I only wanted to agree with Janet and to say that we're seeing that in the Australian side with the tax office issuing their tax remit requirements, and including a graph on what you've spent your tax on, which is, so, you've got to have an audited financial statement from which you can extract this kind of information, which Janet has more articulately explained.
Going to follow on, David, and from Janet, the same thing. I remember years ago, Lee Parker and employee reporting, and when that came in, so you had the financial statements, then you created an employee report for the employees of the organisation at a level they could understand, that type of thing. So it's not dissimilar to what you're saying there. That was all.
Thank you, Graham. Keith?
Just one last quick comment. Just following on from, in particular, what Janet and David have been saying, in terms of who uses public sector financial reports and the like, we're coming from a position on the assumption that, yes, their preparation's important. So but there's been some very important observations here, and I just want to refer back to what David said before about how ministers tend to use these on an exception basis. Now, if we wound up doing if a lot of research was conducted and it found out that ministers or their officers are pretty much I was going to say the only users, but let's say the dominant users or the predominant users, and they were only using these on an exception basis. So there's a comfort level that, yes, they're being prepared, they're being audited, and we're taking an attitude that no news is good news on that. That's a very important observation. That's not nothing. That's actually an extremely important observation, extremely important information to us, in that it will inform where we put our efforts in developing public sector accounting standards. So we might not agonise over certain particular elements, getting impairment right, for instance, that sort of thing. And so it will, what I'm trying to say is it will indicate where we should be channeling our efforts. We really want to channel our efforts on what's useful. And we don't know what's useful until we know who the users are and how they're using those reports. So even what might seem like a mundane sort of observation coming out of research, it's not. So I certainly encourage you all again to continue this sort of research because it is quite important to us.
Thank you, Keith. I was wondering if before we end this session, Anthony would like to add anything.
No, not. I'm just echo all those points, and hopefully I wasn't misunderstood. That financial reports are extremely important from a governance and accountability perspective. It's just me throwing out a morning question, which has prompted some good discussion. So that's fantastic. Oh, it's still morning for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, David. And thank you to the AASB for making the time on a Sunday morning to present to our SIG. We'll break for morning tea now and we'll be back at 11:30 for paper presentations. Thank you.
Thank you.
indicators were used based on the availability of data. I have made slight modification on Bauman's capacity sustainability performance measurement, which I have explained in the paper in detail. The findings shows that the organized 244 organizations lowest criterion bias information criterion value is at the 3 cluster model. Therefore, these organization can be clustered into 3. Further, the input variables that I use to cluster the variables are significantly different among the 3 clusters. Based on these features of the 3 clusters, I have renamed the clusters as revenue balance model, revenue concentrated model, and revenue differentiated model. And the outcome variable of this model shows that the financial sustainability indicators, that is net profit margin and return on assets, are significantly different among the clusters. However, the financial capacity variables are not significantly different among the clusters. Based on this identification, the 3 models were explained, where revenue balance model that consists of 111 organizations, which has more balanced resources than the other 2 models. And compared to other 2 models, this model has comparatively balanced use of volunteers and paid staff ratio. However, this model shows high financial sustainability ratios compared to the other 2 models. The second model is revenue concentrated model, which consists of 77 organizations. In this model, high revenue concentration was on government funding, which is an indication that organization in this model cater more supported residents. And also, this model has less volunteer staff usage than the other 2 models. And this model has comparatively low financial sustainability ratio indicators. However, it is much better than the third model, which is revenue differentiated model. The revenue differentiated model consists of 56 organizations, and this model has revenue from residents is higher than the other 2 models, which is an indication that the model organizations in this model are catering more non-supported residents, or else they are providing services, extra or additional services to attract more income from residents. So this model's more prominent feature is they are using more volunteers than the other 2 models and very lowest financial sustainability compared to the other 2 models. These 3 models bring number of opportunities and risks to the organization in this model, where revenue balance model, which has balanced income sources, which is an indication that they are likely to have both financial autonomy and control. Similarly, this model is earning more profit than the other 2 models, which can be used as a backup to meet financial shocks, and also can be used to reinvest to provide innovative service provision. And the risk of this model is they are earning a higher profit than the other 2 models, which should not be at the expense of service quality. And the other model is revenue concentrated model. This model is having high number of paid staff, which means there may be staff who are having good skill and experience in the field. So they may be in a position to provide quality services than the other 2 models. And another opportunity for this model is this model has more revenue from government, which can be seen as a financial stability and which may bring number of positive effects. However, this also can be a risk for this model because high reliance on government funding also may bring some negative impacts, such as financial austerity and policy uncertainties. And another risk of this model is this model has a comparatively high leverage than the other 2 models, where due to COVID impact, it is expected that in residential aged care, the residential accommodation deposits can be withdrawn from, there can be a higher outgoing residents from the residential aged care facility. Therefore, there can be higher expectation for taking the residential accommodation deposit. They may find difficult to pay off with the higher leverage, which is highly based on residential accommodation deposit is based on the company's leverage. Other one is revenue differentiated model, which has comparatively low financial capacity than the other two models. So they may make this opportunity, there's opportunity for them to meet the unexpected cash outflow that arise from residential accommodation deposits. And this cohort has chances to introduce more innovative services, not only because of their customer base, who appears like high mean tested residents, and also they have high equity balance, unspent equity balances, which they can use for their innovative service provision. And the risk of this model is their revenue sources are highly diversified, which can force them to go mission against the mission. And also these organizations, they are highly depending on residents. Sometimes it may bring some negative consequences. And another risk of this model is high reliance on volunteer support, where there can be negative consequences such as high turnover of volunteers, and sometimes they may not be with the required skills and experience. So there can be quality issues in this model. Contribution of this study, where the three business models were identified, and this extends the business model literature in the not-for-profit aged care setting using the extent of resource dependence on non-market external resources, which has not been hitherto undertaken. And it also offers valuable information for residential aged care managers in assessing their funding risk profile and identifying the impact of dependence on volunteer and for their service provision. And other one is these findings will augment the aged care policy development about aged care funding, its financial risk, and volunteer involvement in the service provision. The study is subject to certain limitation, where the service providers' presence in business model is sensitive to the factors that were considered to cluster, and also the bears information criterion value to use the clustering. Therefore, the finding cannot be generalized to other sectors. And the second one is most of the financial data available at the ACNC level or provider level. So that limits the understanding of how the locational factor, the service provider level, is influencing performance and attracting volunteers. Another, so the future research may consider this and do some case studies on facility level, how these factors are impacting. And the limited information about the volunteer staff, whether they are using as a supplement or supplementary resource or complementary resource, is another factor that was not detailed in the available data. So the future research may consider this and do some case studies to identify how the volunteer support involvement and how they are involved in the aged care facility will improve the business model and their performance. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Given we are a little bit behind on time, so we might take questions after all presentations. So thank you, Jyoti, for this great presentation on a timely research project. Our next presenter are Alex Williamson and Tracy Zhu. Their presentation is about disclosures of charities, a scoping review of a literature.
Thank you, Ushi, and thank you, everyone. I'm keenly aware that it is a Sunday morning and you're all here in the room and online, and I am very grateful for that. So I'm presenting today on behalf of my colleague from the School of Accountancy at QUT, Tracy Q, and myself. This paper is a paper in progress, so it's one that hasn't been submitted to a journal. It's a work in development, and we would therefore very much appreciate any feedback, questions, suggestions, ideas, discussion, all of the good things. So I would, however, is the big button working? Yes. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners, both at QUT, where Tracy and I work, but also here in Melbourne today. So in QUT, that's the Turrbal and the Yugara people. And here in Melbourne, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits, recognising that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. And today is also the first day of NIDOC week. So I think it's always a good idea to talk about the motivations for a study as to why you think what you're doing is actually interesting and important. And for us in this circumstance, we started out sort of thinking we'd do a project looking at charity disclosures, and we went straight to the ACNC data on charities, and we were starting to get into it, and we thought, okay, we better have a look at the literature and see what is already known. And what we discovered by starting to do that literature review was that there actually wasn't a really wide-ranging picture of what the literature on charity disclosures encompassed. And we know it's important because charity disclosures are relevant to their credibility, to the trust that people have in these organisations, and without that, they can't be sustainable. They don't have an ongoing source of funding against which they can deliver their services, accomplish their mission, or at least work towards that. And there are also these interrelated concepts around disclosure of trust, of knowledge, of legitimacy, of power. There are donors and beneficiaries as major stakeholders. And so we thought we needed to, instead of starting our project and drilling down, we needed to start our project and go bigger, go wider, and start to think about the context in which we were doing this research. So this is an initial paper. It's a scoping review. For the purposes of the review, we started out with disclosure being defined as the ways in which and the purposes for which organisations make information available. We ended up shifting that definition slightly as we went on through the review, and that will become obvious in the next couple of slides. But I think there's a nice quote there from Yasmin and Gaffron, which talks about the idea that there is in the literature generally this concept that more disclosure is necessarily better, and that information is power. So that raises questions around what information and power for whom. So we started out with 5 research questions, but I'm going to flip this slide and talk first of all about these 2 key foci that we determined. So we decided to start looking at, it was a very neat binary division between voluntary disclosures and involuntary disclosures. But then we slightly shifted that because we started to think about, well, regulatory disclosures are in there as well, and they're kind of voluntary, but they're kind of involuntary because you can't not do them. So we ended up shifting that focus. Sorry, that slide keeps doing that. We ended up shifting that focus and thinking more for ourselves about this framing of disclosures that originate from charities, whether they are voluntary or regulatory. So they're disclosures that are coming from inside the organisation, internal disclosures, if you like. And then the other category being involuntary disclosures. So those that come from outside the charity but are about the charity. And for each of those 2 foci, we looked at 5 research questions. They're fairly basic ones. So what information is disclosed? Oh, damn that thing. Why is it disclosed?